Well, thank you everybody for coming. Yeah, as Camilla says, one of the things I'm very interested in is sex and gender. I did field work. I've been doing field work for about 25 years amongst the Miskitu, and I spent 2 long-term periods of field work with them, but maybe 10 or 12 periods of shorter field work, between a month and 3 months of the shorter periods of field work. And this has mostly been in a village called Kakabila. I'll talk a little bit more about, to give you some more background on who the Miskitu are and so on. But want to tell you about what I'm interested in terms of the topic rather than the particular group of people. One of the things I'm interested in is that the Miskitu are a group where matrilineal descent is very important. So I'm interested in that, matrilineal descent, and I'm also interested in issues to do with where people choose to go and live after they get married or form a conjugal union of some kind or another. And within, if you like, the ethnographic record, that there are peoples who are where the tendency is for a young couple, once they've established a conjugal union, to live near the woman's parents, in other words, matrilocally, either with or close to their if you like, the wife's family, or patrilocally, which is next to the groom's family. And in common with, I think, a lot of anthropologists, I believe that that question of post-nuptial residence, if we can call it that, is something which is produced by and reproduces ideas about sex and gender in interesting, important ways. And I think also related to that are ideas about what it is that actually constitutes what we might loosely translate as a marriage, because certainly amongst the Miskitu, but certainly amongst other peoples, that the way conjugal unions, if we can use that for perhaps as a term with less, if you like, cultural baggage, the way that conjugal unions are thought of or imagined or brought into being very, very considerably in different parts of the world. And that's really the way marriages come into being is really my kind of starting point. Now, anthropologists have distinguished, if you like, as although these vary within the categories I'm going to talk about in very, very considerably, the anthropologists often make a radical distinction between dowry and bride service as 2 modes of enacting marriages. So these are ways of legitimating conjugal unions, bride service or dowry, and that bride service, usually the emphasis is on the groom's group, giving something to the bride's group and giving some kind of present. It might be something like cattle or pigs or something inanimate or whatever it is. But what that does is it then legitimates a union. So maybe that might be transferred at some moment, possibly at the day of the wedding or another time. And this is partly what legitimates a conjugal union. In the case of dowry, though, which in bride wealth, you find that in a lot of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, in Papua New Guinea, many other parts of the world as well. But dowry, which is being found in many parts of Europe and, for example, in many parts of North India, and for example, though lots of other places as well, that dowry, the gifts go in the other direction. They typically accompany the bride to the groom's group, and sometimes it's rationalised as a kind of form of pre-mortem inheritance, that the bride is getting her inheritance from her family and she carries that over to the groom. In those cases, it's often the case that then the groom's group co-opt the property, her, if you like, pre-mortem inheritance and sort of thing, so it becomes effectively a payment to the groom's group, and the reasons for that are often because of status differentials and other things. And there's a lot of literature about what actually determines bride wealth or dowry, why one kind of style of marriage is preferred in one kind of amongst one particular group and dowry in another, the reasons for that. I don't intend to go really into there. What I really want to do, though, is look at, briefly, look at the difference between bride wealth and another kind of form of legitimating payments called bride service. And bride service is where typically the groom will go and work for the bride's group to some degree or other. So in a way it's like the direction of the gifts, if you like, or the property or gifts, maybe it's gifts in terms of labour, go the same direction as in bride wealth. And bride service and bride wealth are often, if you like, conflated. They're thought of as being very similar, the same kind of thing, because the gifts, whether of labour or property, are going the same way from the groom's group to the bride's group and so on. And so they're thought of as really two really the same kind of thing. But in an interesting and important paper by Collier and Rosaldo called Politics in Simple Societies, which was in a book by Michel Rosaldo Collier, that's right. But Collier and Rosaldo wrote an interesting article which looked very specifically at bride wealth, bride service, really, the giving of gifts, the giving by the groom to the bride's group, and argued that in fact bride wealth and bride service should be rethought. They are actually very, very different, bride wealth and bride service, and produce different kind of ideas about gender, sex and gender, and the logic of bride wealth and bride service is altogether very different. And so if I can think of it here and imagine that it's really the gifts, if you like, the direction of gifts or labour or whatever it is going the same direction from the groom to the bride's group. Now, in the past, that before Collier and Rosaldo, that people thought, well, that bride service is about giving labour, whereas bride wealth is giving gifts. But there wasn't really any kind of understanding of what the fallout of that was. What Collier and Rosaldo did was that they showed that bride wealth and bride service really are two different kinds of marriage altogether. Of course, bride wealth societies, if we can call them that, vary considerably, as do the bride service ones, but by and large, as ideal types, they're quite different. So if we look at bride wealth, which we find, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, that bride wealth involves giving gifts from the groom's group to the bride's group. And what's interesting is that they don't come usually just from the groom himself, but they come, bride wealth comes from the groom's group. So it's quite a kind of, generally speaking, quite a sizable if you like, payment, and what you're buying is not the bride usually as property, but you're buying rights over the bride. You're buying rights over her labour, over her procreative powers, over sexual access, and a number of other things. And very typically, not always, but it's accompanied by patrilocal postnuptial residence, whereby the bride will then, after the wedding, come to live with the groom's group. Yeah. And so what happens is that for a young man to get married, that he's dependent on his senior kin, typically his agnates, which is another word for his patrilineal kin, if you like, his father, father's brother, paternal grandfather, that kind of thing, maybe older brothers, to, if you like, put up the cattle or whatever it is so that he can get married. So his debt is typically vertically up to his senior kin within his group. This is, if you like, the ideal type of how bride wealth works. So it's a vertical debt to his own members of his own group, and that's why you often accompany things by ancestor worship, because things like the importance and respect for senior kin is terribly important in groups of this kind. And usually you find it where important forms of movable property, so livestock, so one finds bride wealth typically among pastoralists, not only, but almost always amongst pastoralists, one finds bride wealth. And examples are, for example, the Nua and Dinka of southern Sudan are classical examples. The Melpa, who are in the Papua New Guinea highlands, where you have pigs. The Levedu in southern Africa, where again cattle is important. These are examples of how this, if you like, constellation of ideas and practices where one finds them. Now, bride service, in the Collier and Rosaldo distinction in terms of these, is altogether works in a completely different way. With bride service, what you have is prestations, or that's meant to be prestations, sorry, from the groom, but from the groom alone. And typically, the groom can't get together enough property to, and this often takes place in societies without much movable property, so one finds bride service in foraging, hunter-gatherer societies, in hunter-horticulturalist societies where there's no cattle or very little cattle. And you find that it's the groom therefore has to provide labour, and because the groom can't expect any help from his own kin, he has to do it all by himself. He has to he can never really get enough for those rights, if they are thought of as rights, over the bride in one go, sort of thing. So he's continually having to work for his wife's kin. He's trying to insinuate himself into the good graces of his in-laws, or affines, as social anthropologists call it. In other words, his wife's kin and her senior kin. So things like the mother-in-law respect relationship is terribly important, and mother-in-law avoidance and respect is terribly important. Typically, it's accompanied by patrilocal postnuptial residence. So, yeah, of course. Sorry, thank you. Someone's keeping awake. But matrilocal postnuptial residence. Yeah. So this is one finds this. And the debt is horizontal, not towards one's own group, but towards one's in-laws, or affines, as anthropologists call the term in-laws, loosely speaking. So it's a horizontal debt. And when I mean horizontal, I mean towards people of more or less one's own generation to one's brothers-in-law, also your parents-in-law, but it's not way up, going up to your ancestors and your grandfathers and all that thing in your own group. It's towards the very living in, could be those of your even same generation, like brothers-in-law and so on, in your wife's group. So the debt is more horizontal to your wife's group rather than vertical to your own group. And typically you find where there's not really anything in land, that movable property, where land is not really important. There's often lots of land, but what's in short supply is labour. In other words, people to go out and help you do things like hunting or plant swidens or go fishing and things like that. So one finds typically bride service in hunter-gatherers and shifting cultivators where slash and burn or swidden farming are practiced. This is where one finds bride service. And some example of this are the Kung, who are Bushman group in Southern Africa, the Mungin in Australia, when the Mungin, before they were all on sort of cattle stations, when they were, the Ilongot, who are hunter-horticulturalist people in the Philippines, the Urarina, who are people in Amazonian Peru. Bride service is extremely common all over Amazonia as well. It's very, very common. So, and what's the Miskitu? An example, a classic example is bride service. To understand the Miskitu, you have to understand that this is a society which is, or if we use the term society, I know it's a term that many anthropologists think rightly have problems with, but if we can just bracket that for now. The Miskitu are, if you like, a people, for most of whom bride service is a really important way. That's how marriages are enacted, through bride service and matrilocality. So the other thing about bride service is men that achieve adult status through marriage. Yeah, so there's this radical distinction between children and adults in many bride service societies, if you like, so that there's a radical difference between adults and marriage, and it's only for males becoming if you like, having a spouse, that one becomes recognised as an adult, that one can entertain by giving other people, men, cassava beer and things like that. It's only when you're listened to in meetings if you're socially an adult and so forth, and there's this distinction between, and so if your wife leaves you or throws you out or something, you'll suddenly become an adolescent again, and no one will listen to you, and you can't entertain through hospitality and so forth. As I said before, marriages are made through insinuating yourself into your wife's group. But often that means that marriages are not suddenly like one day you're not married, the next day there's a ritual, properties exchange, and suddenly you're married. That marriages are negotiated very, very slowly. So the status of being married and not married is something which is continually negotiated, and often that status is not something which is absolute. There are sort of grey areas, particularly amongst younger people. The relationship is so that men's are always afraid that their adult status is going to be compromised through other men who maybe have interest in their wives. So men are deeply suspicious of others who might be competitors. This is very one sort of discourse that Colin Rosaldo found. I think it's true amongst the Miskitu. And what you find is that the brother-in-law relationship between wife giving, brother-in-law, wife taking, if we can use that term, although it's often the groom itself that's given and taken rather than the other way around, that relationship is highly charged, and it's often mediated in some cases through this aesthetic ideal. It doesn't always happen, or even quite rarely happen, through sister exchange, where two men will marry each other's sisters and therefore they don't have a debt to each other. So this is something which is aesthetically terribly pleasing among many Amazonian societies, for example. Also, there's the question of young women often don't really have very little use for husbands in many ways, and often use sexual intercourse as a political weapon. According to Colin Rosaldo, that this is what young women do to control or exercise influence over their husbands, is that they threaten them with liaisons with other men. And, because the marriage isn't something that's written in stone, it's not like a bride wealth society where all of this big amount of cattle has been placed, and that suddenly there is something very concrete called a marriage, and divorce is terribly litigious, and even if a woman's being badly treated, her own kin don't want her to divorce because then there's have to pay back all the cattle. There's nothing like this in foraging societies or hunter horticultural societies with black bride service. Another thing is that because it's about affecting relations and becoming an adult yourself, that the discourses surrounding sexual intercourse are often imagined in terms of recreation rather than procreation. So this is really some things about what bride service looks like. And the Miskitu are hoping to convince you, a society where bride service is very typically found. Is the ordinary way through which conjugal unions come into being and are sustained. Right. First, I want to talk a little bit about them, who the Miskitu are, with whom I've been doing field work. The Miskitu, apart from the Maya group speaking Maya languages, that Miskitu has more speakers than any other Amerindian language in Central America. So there are about 120,000 Miskitu speakers who are all situated on the Caribbean coast and the hinterland of eastern Nicaragua, northeastern Nicaragua, from about here on the Pearl Lagoon going upwards and into Honduras. There are about 30,000 of those are actually in Honduras. Where I did field work was in the Pearl Lagoon Basin, which is this thing here, and this is a map of the Pearl Lagoon here, and in a village called Cacabila. It's interesting because this is, if you like, a Miskitu. There are some villages in here which constitute a Miskitu enclave. It's the southern end of the, if you like, spread of Miskitu villages. And in this lagoon, there are predominantly other villages which are Creole English-speaking. On the Caribbean coast, the southeast Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, as in many other Caribbean parts of Central America, that Caribbean English rather than Spanish is spoken. So, of course, one knows about Belize, but perhaps one might not know that on the Caribbean coast of places like Panama, Costa Rica, and the Bay Islands of Honduras, parts of of eastern Nicaragua, and so on, that English is the first language in many communities. This is a part of eastern Central America. The Caribbean coast of Central America is extremely remote, and up until the 1950s, it was easier to get to Bluefields, which is the capital of the southern half of the Miskitu coast politically, it was easier to get to New Orleans or to Kingston, Jamaica, than it was to get to the national capital, Managua, because there was no roads. There's still no road going from Managua to Bluefields. And there's only one or two sort of rather ropey roads that go between the western part of Nicaragua, which is almost homogenously Spanish-speaking, and eastern Nicaragua, which has people speaking Amerindian languages like Miskitu or Caribbean Nicaraguan English, Mosquito Coast English. This is called the Mosquito Coast as well, which is a kind of Western Caribbean English, which is a little different, but fairly similar in some ways to Belizean English, Cayman Island English, Jamaican English, and so forth. So this is eastern Nicaragua is kind of very remote place, and it's quite different to Hispanic Central America. So I did field work originally in 1992 and 93 in this village in the Pearl Lagoon Basin, which is here, which is called Cacavilla. And at the time it had 280 people, which was a good size because I could get to know everyone, but it was so it was small enough for that, but it was big enough that there was kind of quite a lot going on. Now there's about 900 people there. So the village is expanding. Not all the villages have in that area, but Cacavilla has been quite successful in that way. And the individuals in that community are bilingual in Miskitu, which they consider to be properly the language of the community. They consider themselves, in most contexts, to be Miskitu people, but they're all completely fluent from childhood in Mosquito Coast Creole English as well. So those are the two languages which are spoken in that community. I hasten to add that Mosquito Coast Creole English is very different because there's no trickle down from English as the language of the nation state as there is, say, in Jamaica, and this process of decreolization. That hasn't happened on the Mosquito Coast, so chances are that most of you probably wouldn't understand anything for quite a few months of Mosquito Coast Creole English, but gradually it sort of sinks in, and me speaking now or us speaking to each other wouldn't be understood by most people in those villages either. Okay, so it's just a slide to show how sort of remote the place still is. There's still sort of jaguars prowling around in the forest outside of Cacavilla. There's an area of forest outside the community. It used to be much larger, crossing the River Yari, but gradually Nicaragua, which has a frontier, the Spanish-speaking the settlement farmers, the Nicaraguan frontier has been moving in contrast to the one in the 19th century United States and 20th century Brazil, the frontier in Nicaragua has been moving west to east. So the frontier is coming there, but it's still wild enough for things like tapirs, wild peccaries, jaguars, ocelots, and lots of other kind of things as well out there. Now, what do Miskitu people, well, specifically those in Cacavilla, do? Miskitu people, they've involved in a number of different ways of subsisting. So, for example, some of the coastal Miskitu on the coast of Honduras, a lot of the men are involved in diving for lobster when these boats come along and carry the men out to sea in a lot of their canoes, and they go and get lobster, and it's extremely dangerous because many of the divers suffer from, get attacked by compression sickness, the so-called bends, so it's extremely dangerous. In Cacavilla, which is way to the south in the Pearl Lagoon Basin, that lobster diving has never really been important at all. And when I was first there, I've talked about in another time a presentation about the influence of the cocaine trade, which has now become very significant in this area. But I want to talk about a period before then. I'll mention it again at the end, some of the changes, but for now I want to talk about how it was and still how it is in many respects. That subsistence was organised primarily around slash and burn farming or swidden horticulture. So people would plant their swiddens, different, each house that would, if you like, or each adult male, there was typically one adult male. Sorry?
What's a swidden?
It's slash and burn farming. What you do is you clear and burn that bit of the forest, and in the ashes, that's where you plant. sort of thing. And Miskitu men would do this on a rotational burn basis, so you'd come back to a swidden which had been allowed to grow back on. So it was sustainable in the sense that it was done on a circular basis, the forest would regenerate and so on. This is kind of what they call slash and burn farming, which has been demonized where the ground hasn't been allowed to recuperate in some parts of the world, but here it's done on a rotational basis, so swiddens are allowed to rest over, depending on, for several years, and then, you know, one individual or one household will have a number of different swiddens which are at different phases of being worked or recuperated. So a swidden is planted one year, and then for a second year it will be sort of planted in a much more haphazard, sort of half-assed kind of way, sort of thing, and then allowed to recuperate. So this is purely for subsistence. Cassava is primarily the most important. That's the one that most important. Then there is fishing for cash, and that's horticulture. The actual most of the work, planting your swidden and preparing your swidden and planting it, is done in the dry season of April, May, and so forth. And you prepare it, the swidden, cut it down, the bit of the forest, from February, so through February to the middle of May, which is the agricultural season. The rest of the year is very wet. And what happens during the rainy season is that you fish, and with the your catches, that while I've been there, that there are boats that arrive in the Pearl Lagoon Basin, and the fishermen will carry their catches there and sell them for cash. So people generate cash by selling their catches to these boats that come into the lagoon, and so on. Of course, some fish you can't sell, and other fish, but you can eat. So people will use fish, and quite often, even during the dry season, they'll send the boys and the grandmothers out little boys and grandmothers out in the canoes. Most of the transport is entirely waterborne in canoes, and canoes with sheet sails. So when they go fishing, they go out with boats, which are called dories, which are like dugout canoes with sheet sails, and they set gill nets out in the lagoon to catch. But of course, in the times where they're just catching to eat, they might just go out with hook and line kind of fishing. There are new cash opportunities in the area, which are affecting some of the things I'm actually talking about. Lobster, which is up the coast further north, and doesn't really affect the community. This is where I've been working. Shipping out, where young men who speak English and acquire some degree of competence in international English may go out and get jobs as menials on cruise ships and then send remittances home. So that happens. They'll go out for contracts for anything between 6 to 9 months. That's quite palaver being able to do that. Not all men can do. The young men can do that. And then there's also the influx of or the appearance of the cocaine trade. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But for most of the time that I've been there, and still to a considerable extent, it's fishing for cash and horticulture for subsistence that's important in terms of making a living. Now, what are Miskitu communities actually like in terms of, if you like, domestic organisation? And these are organised by what I've called in a recent book by Laura Hobson Herlihy, who wrote an ethnography on the Miskitu on Honduras. She calls them the Matra group. I call it the similar kind of groups for the community that I worked in, the Confederacy of Sisters. These are completely, I'd never asked for people to stand like this. These are both photos, and I've got plenty more like this, in two villages where I didn't really do field work, the villages that I visited. When you go and ask to take a photograph of some people, that people rush out and get members of their family, and they'll nearly always go and get their women folk, because it's women stick together, and that men they're born, and it's men who marry into those groups. So you have, because of the through bride service and men marrying into the groups matrilocally, in other words, men marry into their wife's group, at least geographically, they'll come and live with their wives' families, and then they'll perhaps build a house for their wife close to their wife's family. This is classic matrilocality, that you get groups of houses, clusters of houses, in particular parts of a village where you have one group of women who form one of these groups, which are called the Confederacy of Sisters. And typically the Confederacy of Sisters is not just sisters, but it's typically a mothers and daughters, mother's sisters, maternal aunts, cousins who are on the mother's side, and so forth. So this is what you typically find. You find they live houses close by that their spouses, or use the term maya, which means spouse, have built for them. So men come and live, attach themselves to these clusters and build a house for the woman with whom they form a conjugal union. And the relationships within the Confederacy of Sisters are built on mutual support, and typically these clusters regard themselves as being hostile to other clusters. So sometimes it's mediated by states of truce between themselves and other similar clusters. There might even be some friendliness, but typically, but quite often, and it varies considerably from case to case, but they might be relations of considerable hostility. And the sister-in-law relationship is one which is extremely barbed and prickly, because your sister-in-law comes from another Confederacy of Sisters, because men marry outside the Confederacy of Sisters in which they've grown up marry into another one Confederacy, and so the sisters-in-law in different Confederacies of Sisters. So sister-in-law is an extremely delicate relationship. Now, here's another one for where I did do field work. This is one called in a village called Karawala, which is actually an Ulwa village, but Ulwa are Miskitu speaking now. And this is again, these are all three sisters and the mother, and it's not a husband, but it's a brother. So this is the brother. Yeah. So this is typically, this is a photo. This woman Francella was fantastic. She just told my wife and I just so much about sort of kind of love medicine to catch men, love medicine to hate medicine to make women leave men, and all kinds of things. She was a real sort of obia woman, you know. So she was a real character, Francella. Now, what you have is that, of course, when an old lady, the old woman, the kuka, the head of these confederacies is usually the oldest woman who has several daughters around her, that she is known as the kuka, respected old woman, that means kuka. And it also means grandmother. And what you have is that in the cluster, it's typically the kuka and perhaps her several daughters, perhaps conceivably a younger sister and perhaps one or two her daughters, and then their children and any men that have married her daughters, or married her daughters and granddaughters. So this is what you have. This is the group that you have, the Confederacy of Sisters, or we could call it a matrilineage if we look at it in terms of kinship. Now, if we imagine, I know these are all, I nicked this diagram off the internet, but if one can imagine that these are circles, if you're anthropologists, you'll know that the circles means women, triangles mean men. But imagine these are circles, please. And you have, you know, the kuka at the top there, and these are her daughters, and then granddaughters and great-granddaughters, and so on. And what one finds is that if the old lady, when she dies, or even perhaps if she gets weak and loses her influence, that there might be a tussle for control over the cluster, and then it might segment into two. So you've got two new clusters with different one point. So you've got this is what anthropologists call fission. So you've got the fission of the matrilineage, but in some contexts, if two groups have split off, they might still be quite friendly, and if they are somehow get into a bad fight or a row with someone else, that they'll come together in what Evans Pritchard famously called fusion. So the processes of fission and fusion, as described by structural functionalist anthropologists like Evans Pritchard and others, sort of one sees that very much in play. And also that in terms of the way many Miskitu people describe their kinship is like that. So, for example, Kakabila, that people say that Kakabila was founded by a man called Cristobal Vega and Sylvester Joseph. It was founded by two men, but Cristobal Joseph had 5 or 6 daughters. They're all named there. They had 5 or 6 daughters. Angelina was actually married to Sylvester Joseph, the other man who came with him, and the other 4 daughters all married men who came from outside. Yeah, this is the story now of how the founding of Kakabila. Now, the important thing about that is you have the sisters are all together and the men come together from outside. Now, whether that really happened or not is because these women, Angelina, Claudina, Prida, these are the grandmothers of the grandmothers who were there when I was first there, or still today. They're saying that's our grandmother's grandmothers sort of thing. The point is that there's documentary evidence. In fact, Kakabila is much older than when people say it was founded, because there's this process of telescoping where some relatives are sort of pruned out, and they've liked, and they emphasise the fact, a style of a myth of origin of the village, which in some sense represents what they think is how political processes of marriage, sex and gender actually work in the village. So this notion of 5 sisters and men marrying in from out is very much a classic kind of, one would expect nothing less in a society organised around this type. And as I've said here, that with the loss of a kuka, that you have fission and fusion and so forth. So this is what can be like. Now, how is actually this actually enacted through ritual is something that I want to talk about a little bit. But no, before that, I want to talk about men, what men do in this community. Well, as I said, that men attach themselves as affines, that's anthropology term for in-laws, and establish relations with brothers-in-law, fathers-in-law, wife's mother's brother. All these terms are reciprocal terms, so 2 brothers-in-law will call themselves each other Waikat, or Dapna as father-in-law, but it's also son-in-law, and so forth. So they will try and establish relations with their affines within the same group. But of course, one has to remember that the relations are often much less prickly than they are with their female relatives, who may regard them as some sense in marrying outsiders, because their own fathers-in-law and may also be thought of as outsiders, because earlier, maybe a generation previously, they've married in as well. And also that men need in-laws in which to organise things like productive processes. So this is a father-in-law and his son-in-law drying some sea shrimp over a thing. So when you see 2 men cooperating or going out fishing, it's typically 2 brothers-in-law or a father-in-law or son-in-law or something like that. So this is the way that men construct relations. Imagine their relationships in terms of dyads, them and another man who's typically an in-law. So whereas women imagine sociality through primarily in terms of consanguineal relatedness of sisters and classificatory sisters, maybe not real sisters, but people who thought of as sisters within their own group, that men imagine themselves as in-laws with other men who singly with other men in a one-to-one relationship as affines. And these affinal relationships are reproduced through drinking rituals, and all men often, particularly those when they come back from fishing and have got some cash, they'll go out and drink together, and even if they're not really brothers-in-law, they'll drink a lot together and call each other brother-in-law and drink a lot. And I found a very lovely account via a 1930s naturalist who went out looking for wild geese in Nicaragua and reports one of these rituals far back as 80 years ago. Said these men started calling each other brother-in-law. And this is how Miskitu men often operate, that when they meet you for the first time, if they meet you for the first time and you're a male and they're a male, they will use the term waik, which doesn't mean, which not only means brother-in-law, but it also means person with whom I wish to establish an exchange relationship or some kind of friendly solidarity with you. They'll call you waik, brother-in-law. Yeah? And as I say, that if you go and drink with them, then that will perhaps cement your waikat, which waik is just short for waikat relationship. So what they also do is relationships with their affines, men with these affines, are somewhat sort of problematic, and they are typically with their female affines are rather difficult. And whereas they might cultivate sort of joking and sexual banter relationships with their wives' sisters, who sometimes, occasionally, they might even try and get off with in some cases, but things like their mother-in-law and senior female affines, typically project extreme avoidance and respect. You're not supposed to be in the same room a lot of the time and some men argue with your mother-in-law. You don't talk to her face to face or call her by her name. You call her, if you're using English, Creole English, you call her old woman, or you just call her kuka or muliyati, which means mother-in-law, and you don't face her. You turn your back to her and talk in a high squeaky voice as a form of avoidance. That's how you address your mother-in-law, and so forth. So the mother-in-law son-in-law relationship in bride service, as for many bride service societies, is one that's extremely charged. It's perhaps the most charged of all those kind of relationships. Now, interestingly, here's a photo that I took in Karawala, which is, as I say, the Ulwa village, but Miskitu speaking. And I took this photo at, they asked me to take it. I was asked to take this photo and give them back a copy. And I was asked to take this photo and send them a copy. And these are a number of men at a funeral of an old lady, one of these kukas, who has died, and all of these men, you know, you can guess what they are. They're not her sons, they're her sons-in-law. She's managed, they wanted a photo of her female kin wanted a photo of all these sons-in-law who'd come to pay respect to her. These are the, if you like, the sons-in-law that the Kuka Santa, as she was known, had captured for her daughters. She'd captured these sons-in-law for her daughters, and this is her, Kuka Santa, after death, exercising her agency over them by having them all kind of looking rather sheepishly together in a row and having a photo taken, evidence of her influence over them. So these are Kuka Santa's sons-in-law. You see the shotgun in the background there.
Is that what it is?
Yeah. You see there, just to the left of the left person's head. Anyway. So, shame. Men and women, they still have to, if you like, construct sociality or construct their relationship ritually in some way, arguably. And how do they do it? So, men are arguably, some way, women imagine them, or sometimes project this, as resources to be captured and domesticated. And this comes out quite a lot in Laura Hobson-Hurley's book, which is called The Mermaid and the Lobster Diver. And they do this through partly, some women do it through magic, and that men are always complaining that their wives, that they're weak, their wives control them too much, and because they give them panty water, which is panty water is water that's filtered through their wives' dirty knickers, and then they're somehow fed to them, and this is how that they're controlled by this. There are all lots of other kinds of medicine, but panty water's one of the most famous. And so you have this capture of men who are domesticated. And then you have this ritualization of this notion of capture of males in a ritual which in Kakabila takes place once a year in January. It's a day that's given over to this event, which is known as Kitty Alley. And Kitty Alley, this is Kitty Alley. What Kitty Alley? It's a bowling game. And what they do is they construct this. This is what they call the strench or trench in international English, where it's a bowling alley. And the men spend the whole day playing the women in different innings according to rules that I don't really understand. I don't know quite, still not sure entirely how it's scored. The three main pins, the king pin, the queen pin and another pin, but you try and bowl them and you get points for doing that, and then it's scored. All the men have a go, or the adult men. Children are not allowed to play this. There's this marked distinction between adults and children, and so, you know, that's one incentive to become married, and, you know, you can do these kind of things. And I said to them, and every year that I've said this, I say, who wins Kitty Alley? And they always say, oh, the women win, the men just get too drunk and the women win. So, well, this is what one might expect. So men sort of through constructing rituals of solidarity with themselves reproduce their control by women. And that while they're playing, that the men sit on one side, which is marked by, and women sit on the other side. And while the men are bowling, the younger men in particular, the women direct a tirade non-stop of taunts, saying that if they don't flunk their shots or miss their shots, they won't give them access to their daughters later that night at the dance. I mean, it's just banter, really, but if you like, it's sort of indicative of the kind of complexion of gender relations in this particular community. As I said, this is very important, the distinction between children and adults, and the incentive to become an adult is quite considerable in many ways. So there's this very marked distinction in Miskitu communities. So children are always shooed out of the way. If old people are talking about things, they'll send the children away. You don't listen to children, and adults purport not to know what's going on in the children's worlds. Of course, children are really fascinated to know what the adults are doing because they're not told anything. So, and of course, being children, they're curious. Men become become almuk, that means an adult, through the fact of having a maya, a spouse. Women become almuk through the sheer fact of childbirth. That's what turns a woman into a social adult. That these distinctions are encoded in Kakabila in a number and in other Miskitu communities in interesting ways. But in Kakabila, that one of the ways is through language. So this is very interesting that Kakabila has two sociolects. One of them is Miskitu, which is an Amerindian language, and adults use that amongst themselves, and children use the Creole English amongst themselves, and adults use the Creole English with children. But as children approach adulthood and as they want to begin to the process of reinventing themselves as adults, they'll start to use Miskitu, which of course they still know passively and still use it occasionally, and will start reinventing themselves as adults, partly through the process of speaking Miskitu. And these are completely different languages because Creole English is a Western Caribbean English, whereas Miskitu is a Misumalpan Amerindian language, so they're completely different.
What would they have used beforehand? Because they haven't had English for that long.
Well, Miskitu have been speaking English since, some of them since 1700 as a second language, particularly in this part, so it's a long process. I think probably in this area, probably since about 100 years ago to 80 to 100 years ago that Miskitu became a co-first language. But it was what happened was that in Kakabila that all the people spoke Miskitu all the time, but they all spoke Creole English, but during the Contra War, Kakabila was evacuated for 2 years, and children picked up the habit of speaking English when they were evacuated in Pearl Lagoon, which is a Creole English-speaking community. The community was evacuated for 2 years during the Contra War in the 80s. Another way that the distinction is encoded is through the manatee. The manatees are, you see 3 manatees here, that's a really big one there. The manatees, these are all my photos, the manatee is captured in moonlit nights in June, feeding off grasses in the little creeks that feed into the lagoon. There's only maybe at the most 3 or 4 captured a year, so it's kind of a rare event. And what happens is that the manatee, I think this is less now than it used to be, but certainly when I was first there, that like this manatee here, that the manatee that they would, once it was killed, it would be butchered, that the meat was divided equally between all the households, therefore, if you like, producing a unity that perhaps wouldn't there when you have these different confederacies of sisters at war with each other, that they are fused, if you like, into the one big confederacy through giving each household getting the manatee meat. But then the guts are given just to the children. So if you're given the guts, you're still a child socially. But the head, very interestingly, is taken by an old woman or an old man and boiled in a big oil drum and served on a plate that only adults are allowed to eat. And plates are distributed to all the adults. So you know you're an adult when you get part of the manatee head to eat is eaten. There's a lot of magic about manatees, about how to find them. There are all kinds of amulets. There's supposedly a rock out there on the side of the lagoon which turns round to show where the manatee are and things like that. So manatee has what they call a guardian spirit owner, what they call a dawanka in Miskitu. This idea of guardian spirit owners is something which is important, which I haven't got time to talk about now. So one way in which young people can invent themselves as adults is through this ritual, which also takes place in January, like Kitty Alley, and it's 1 day a year, which is called Moscow. And Moscow is a masked dance. And what it does is that what the dancers do is, this is, if you like, the official way of showing yourself ready to be adult. But what they do is that young men and a few young women, that they'll get together and they'll decide they're going to put on Moscow this year, and they'll, on the day, they'll all appear dressed up so their identities are hidden. You can't see who they are, even their hands and arms are covered, their faces are covered by masks, you see that one there, and that they go and sell dances to go around from house to house It takes the whole day to do that with a guitarist, who's an older man usually, selling dances to each household. And the people sitting on the parents on the verandas, often the older couple, will sort of laugh and joke with them and say, oh, these Moskos are really good. They must have come all the way from Managua or something. That they try and represent them as people we don't know, hence the masks, the strangers. So this is, if you like, encodes the idea that your people who come to you and you deal with are from outside. And so it's a way, through doing Moscow, that young people who wouldn't normally engage with adults show that they're ready to contract relationships with adults, with the confederacies of sisters and so on. What they do is, while they're going around doing the Moscow, they have this dance where they lampoon sexual intercourse and the childbirth. As often like one of the Moscow is another figure who's not masked, but it's the doctor who carries a bag, and ones who pretending to have children will come and be attended to by the doctor and things like that. And another interesting thing is that they carry these little switches, these little sticks, and what happens is the children, of course, are really excited because this is a big event of the year, and they try and get close to them and try and guess who they are, but they're beaten off by the adults with these switches. And this is the way by which Miskitu adolescents, these who are dancing, distance themselves from childhood by whipping the children away and say, look, go away, we're singing to the adults, kind of thing. Here's some Moscow masks, so there's kind of a number of those. I think some of you can take a photo, so I won't do it too quickly. Yeah. So you can see that some of them, I mean, this is the ones on the bottom left are more typically, but some of the others are a little bit more elaborate, as you can see. One's commercially bought, the one with RIP on it, I think it's a commercially bought mask, which is, I don't know, but the others I think are typically homemade. Okay. Right, now that's the official discourse, but there's an unofficial way of protesting, trying to become an adult and showing this. And this is through a phenomenon which is called greasy sickness, which means crazy sickness. And it's called fits sometimes in Kakabila as well. It's more commonly called fits. And what this is these are, it's a form of hysteria, which is adolescent women in Miskitu villages. Not all by any means, but sometimes adolescent women that they'll get attacked where for weeks or even months, they'll be every night when the sun starts to go down, they'll start going crazy, as they put it, and pick up a bottle or a machete and waving it around and running out into the bush. And typically they won't come out of the house through the door but through a window, and they'll go out into the bush, and they have to send out young men to restrain them and bring them back, like this one here, top of the photo. And then sometimes they're tied up and brought back. And what's interesting about greasy sickness is it's often contagious. So many Miskitu communities where they have greasy sickness is that you'll have a number of young women who will be affected at the same time, and they'll all run out of the house. And when one runs out of the house, you hear all the big hubbub of the village, and then the other women who may be similarly affected will all run out of the village. And usually shamans will eventually diagnose that it's some kind of spirit is possessing them, and will put some dietary prohibitions and other medicine to cure them, and may work or it may not, and so on. And after perhaps a few weeks or a few months, this will go away. And what it is that I think is that, and often that these girls, when they come to, these young women, that they're told that they have been forced to have sex with various characters from the Miskitu demonology, like monsters of various kind, or sometimes wealthy sea captains and Spaniards, which is what they call Spanish-speaking Nicaraguans and so on. So it's the exotic, erotic, dangerous stranger, which is the figure there. And I think this has something to do with dilemmas posited by the project of having to invent yourself as an adult woman, because at the one time you're supposed to, as young women, are supposed to project this kind of shame, or swira, as they call it at Miskitu, be sexually continent. But on the other hand, it's hoped that they will be able to attract suitable sons-in-law for their mothers and older kin and brothers-in-law and so forth. And what this is a way of saying, look, I want to do this by myself. And there's a story which is called a kissi, which is a Miskitu myth or folk tale. It's more, people know that they're not true. They call they say they're not. They say they're kunin, which means lies, but they're folk tales. and one of them is a Jack, which is a sort of, if you like, it's a bit like the Rapunzel story, but it's a sort of bride service version of Rapunzel kind of thing, and where the son-in-law has to win the bride, and eventually he subverts the king, trying to keep him at bay, away from his daughter, and the king has to accept it. And I think it's a story about, well, whatever happened, that these young people are going to do what they do, and parental influence over young women is always kind of quite partial sort of thing. That I wanted to talk about 3 Kakabila stories, but I think I'm just going to give you one, which is I think illustrative of that. And then what I'll do is, when we do that, we're getting kind of quite close to the break. So this is this story is of one. It's the one from Sibella and Bam Bam. And Sibella and Bam Bam are mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, son-in-law, mother-in-law and son-in-law. And this is, I think, something which is a classic case of, if you like, what happens amongst the Miskitu, or certainly in Kakabila. So, okay, and what it is I'm just going to read this. It's only a couple of pages, and what it is that it's me putting together what something. I took field notes when I was in the field on this at different moments from this story, and then I put them together. And then what this is me doing was a bit later, after field work, shortly after field work, was trying to kind of make sense of all these events by writing it down into what I think the whole story was about. So these, if you like, are second generation field notes. So they're a bit raw, but they'll give you a kind of sense. Okay, I'll read you it. Bam Bam, Sibella's son-in-law, had a reputation for being something of a boaster, a loudmouth who considered himself the coolest and most sophisticated young man in the village. People said he was a drinker, a spendthrift who spent all his money on rum, a social hazard who, when drunk, would talk incessantly about his prowess in various spheres. To most of the village men, he was something of a figure of fun. However, they tended to be wary of him because he thought he was also a thief. Becky, his wife, that's Sibella's daughter, was a rather shy girl with a well-developed sense of shame. Her mother-in-law considered her rather feckless and would often refer to her as that crazy girl, while her younger sister, Katie, said that she considered Becky to be a dunce. So it's just, talking to villagers, I learnt that some years previously, Becky had eloped with Bam Bam to live patrilocally with his parents in their house uptown at the other end of the village. Sibella had been furious about the elopement and had told Becky that she had acted very foolishly. Since she had made her decision without parental consent, she would not be allowed to return home. So they effectively disowned her. And you notice that this goes against the stated what I said about Miskitu marriages being matrilocal. Becky gave birth to a son and then to a daughter, but she was never happy in Bam Bam's parents' house, where she was allegedly victimised by Bam Bam's mother and Bam Bam's maternal aunts, the other confederacy of sisters, who lived close by. Bam Bam therefore built a little ramshackle house next to his parents, into which he, Becky and the 2 babies moved, partly in an attempt to ease the tensions between Becky and his own matrilateral kinswoman. However, things didn't improve for Becky. Away from his father, who sometimes beat him up for drinking, Bam Bam allegedly often spent his money on rum, coming home drunk and beating her. Having had enough, Becky patched things up with her own mother, Sibella, and fled Bam Bam's house while he was out fishing, returning home to her parents with her 2 children. According to Bam Bam, Becky left him on this occasion because it was her, Becky's uncle, Anestro, had told her falsely that he'd been periodically visiting another woman in Orinoco. Becky's gullibility and jealousy, he told me, had precipitated her flight. By the time I came to Kakabila, Bam Bam had ingratiated himself. This is all before I came to Kakabila, but what people told me. By the time I came to Kakabila, Bam Bam had ingratiated himself with his parents-in-law and was living rather uneasily in their house as their acknowledged son-in-law. So you have the switch now of having left his parents' home or area, had come back to hers, and he's had to come along following her, behind her, sort of thing. As I already noted, Kakabila people regard the mother-in-law, son-in-law relationship as one which should be conducted with extreme respect. Arguments and fights between a man man and his mother-in-law being considered the paradigm example of Saura Iwaya, living bad. That's the worst thing you can do, is row with your mother-in-law. Bam Bam's relationship with Sabella, his mother-in-law, was generally conducted with the appropriate tokens of respect, but this concealed a bitter tussle for control over Becky, which they both privately and separately acknowledged to me. One of the most bitterly contested issues was Bam Bam's right to beat Becky. Bam Bam was occasionally hitting Becky, and this really rankled with Sabella, that's her mother. Shortly after my arrival in Kakabila, Becky became pregnant again. She eventually bore a baby boy and entered into the 9 days of postpartum seclusion required of Kakabila women. On the 10th day, she emerged onto the house veranda with the baby, an act which provoked an incident. Kakabila people believe that a mother and baby should not come out of the house too soon after a birth because of the risk of the baby catching fresh cold, that's a head cold, and subsequently dying. Fresh cold is something they consider a really dangerous illness. According to Katie, Becky's younger sister, Bam Bam, on seeing his wife and baby on the veranda, began to hit Becky. Katie ran to fetch her mother, who came running back to the house to demand an explanation. Bam Bam told Sabella, remember he's confronted now by his mother-in-law, that he had not really been hitting Becky, but just been banging her head against the wooden house wall to knock some sense into her and shouting at her because she brought the baby out of the house. Given his side of the story later, Bam Bam told me that he'd been angry at Becky for risking the baby's health by bringing it out so soon, though of course technically the 9 days had elapsed. Despite the fact that he worked hard for his children, he added, he was too poor to buy medicine for a sick baby. That's if she'd got fresh cold for coming out the house during the seclusion period. In the row that followed, according to Sabella, his mother-in-law, Bam Bam demonstrated a lack of respect by telling her that he would never build his house next to hers. In other words, he wasn't going to build it matrilocally. This is really insulting to his mother-in-law. Sabella claimed that by remarking that he would not build his house to hers, Bam Bam had showed her a lack of respect. It was this, she told me now, which now prompted her to banish Bam Bam from the house. While Bam Bam left in disgrace, Becky, along with her 2 children, remained in the house with her mother. In trying to make sense of this course of the voice up to this point later, Bam Bam expressly told me that he felt his relationship with his mother-in-law was bad because she tried to control Becky too much. He told me that since Becky was his woman, it was up to him to decide what she did and did not do. He added that he was always respectful to his mother-in-law, but made it clear that he thought she should relinquish her rights over Becky. Bam Bam left his parents-in-law's house. He didn't go back to his own parents' house because it was said he did not get on well with his father, and moved in with his maternal grandparents, who lived with 2 adult daughters, 1 son-in-law and several grandchildren on the other side of the village. He no longer walked down the front road, the main street which ran the length of the village, and took to furtively poling a dory along the edge of the lagoon so no one could see him going up and down. He was very embarrassed because he's been made an adolescent again by all of this. After 2 months of exile, Becky's father, George, that's his father, Bam Bam's father-in-law, relented and agreed to let Bam Bam come back into the house. George, Becky's father, had a much more relaxed relationship with his son-in-law. Bam Bam would accompany him gillnet fishing and turtling, and demonstrated a capacity for hard work which George clearly valued. Thus, when the village cooperative secretary of the Fishermen's Union of Pearl Lagoon collected the first membership fees at a meeting I attended, George was not only the only one of the first men to actually pay his fee, but even paid for Bam Bam, prompting the other men present to remark that there's a real father-in-law. Typically, Bam Bam told me that he had been at perfect liberty to return to his parents' house at any time, but had refrained from doing so until he was good and ready. At first, Bam Bam made an effort to reform and tried hard to be a model son-in-law. He told me that he would give up drinking and save his money. Some he would give to his mother-in-law. The rest he would spend on Becky and the 3 children. So you get a sense of what is the moral ideal in the community from something like this. He began to rip lumber, that's to cut board in the forest with the village sawyer, and with the help of his father-in-law and an adolescent brother-in-law, began to build a house right next to George and Sabella's. It was common knowledge in the village that had been Bam Bam's assertion that he would never build his house next to Sabella's, which had provoked her to throw him out in the first place. So the appearance of a frame for Bam Bam's new house created some interest. As Albertina, Sabella's sister, expressed it, this capitulation over the location of the new house was a sure sign that Becky was now oficial, that means boss, it's Spanish, but it's slang for, and Bam Bam was now raza, that means down. From both those terms come from Spanish. They're Spanish words that are used to emphasize those kind of relations of hierarchy. And as she also told me, as Albertina said, she said, talking about She says, Mairin kau power brisa, which would mean women have more power. And so he said, back in his parents' house, Bam Bam began to slip back into his old ways, drinking and allegedly stealing money from Sabella. The money earned from fishing and turtling, which should have been spent completing the new house, was spent on rum, while the house frame that had quickly been erected became a climbing frame for the downtown children, who were never fitted with lumber walls or zinc roof. Tension between Bam Bam and Sabella began to mount again, and Sabella began to mutter to her closest friends that she might have to send Becky away from Kakabila to work, partly to get her out of Bam Bam's reach and partly to knock some sense into for Becky, getting her sense knocked into her from all sides. The Christmas season came to Kakabila, and two of Sabella's sisters arrived to spend money at the holiday season with her parents. These sisters, Witty and Gloria, had married Spaniards, which is mestizos, Spanish-speaking Nicaraguans, and now lived on the Pacific side of Nicaragua. They become much Hispanicized and were regarded as being very sophisticated by the village women. As their village drew towards a close, it was decided by Sabella's parents and these sisters that two younger sisters, Mick and Telia, would go with them. It was thought that some time spent on the Pacific coast would be beneficial to the two girls. They would learn better Spanish and become, like their elder sisters, more experienced, meaning more worldly wise. The plan to send the girls was public knowledge in the village. Unknown to Bam Bam, Sabella was also planning to spirit Becky away with them. While Bam Bam was at sea hunting turtle with George, his father-in-law, Sabella's sisters left Kakabila for Managua. With them went Becky and her youngest baby. Bam Bam returned to the village after a week and was taken by complete surprise. He later told me he'd been totally unprepared for this term of events and had been quite devastated. In spite of the fact that Becky had gone, Bam Bam remained in residence in Sabella's house, continuing to consider himself her son-in-law and therefore responsible for his two older children who remained in Sabella's care. He repeatedly questioned his father-in-law about whether Becky would be coming back to Kakabila, and if so, when. George, his father-in-law, told him she would be coming back at some point, implying that the time would depend on his behaviour. Eventually, after a year, she did come back, and they did construct a house next to Sabella and George's. But I think this is sort of not untypical of the way that the whole kind of process of establishing marriage is. The course of true love is never smooth in Kakabila as it isn't anywhere, and I don't think that this is altogether untypical kind of thing. Right, this is just some last slides. This is just to diagrammatically represent what Kakabila was like. When I first did fieldwork, you have these confederacies of sisters. These are consanguinely related if you're of the same colour, so you can see that the white triangle has gone married out of his own group of sisters, his confederacy, his own cluster matri group, and has married into another one, and so forth. So this is Karawala, where I did fieldwork, was another Miskitu village that there was no work, and that there weren't opportunities for farming or fishing, and that men became often thrown out of their houses by their wives. So that what happened is that slide where you have the son-in-law, of the young man with his sisters rather than the husband. That was in Karawala. So. That Whitener use apple because there's no work in Karawala, no opportunities to grow cassava because there's too much cocaine addicts stealing off the Swidens and things like that. So this is a community in a state of crisis when I was there, and that young men who are no use to other confederacies have to remain with their mothers and daughters, like that picture I showed you. So that was Karawala, but still you've got this confederacy of sisters. Koori, where Laura Herlihy did her fieldwork, nearly finished now, had an interesting case where men would go out 9 months of the year. They'd be out going out for month-long periods at a time hunting lobster, and that men really would be effectively out of the picture for a lot of the time for 9 months of the year. And basically they'd often have several wives, if you like, in different communities, and women would also might have several different husbands, sort of thing. So this is Koori, which is described by Laura. But again, you've got this what she calls the matri groups, but it's the same thing. The confederacies of sisters are very similar, but what the men are doing is different. And then you've got Kakabila, how it's moving in the present with the drugs and a lot of money coming into the community. That with a lot of money that a few men are making, that they're building cement houses, and cement houses being much more permanent, unlike board houses and leaf houses, which were traditional kind of Miskitu houses, which you could move a board house to, after a while. And some men would do that. So after a while, they'd go and move somewhere else away from their wives' kin, And a leaf house, you know, was never permanent anyway. But with cement houses, you better be sure where you're going to build it. And so men are tending to build them near their own kin now. And you're having this thing of where the man here, like these triangles with their own colour, the red triangle there, white triangle there. These are men who have made money from cocaine and build their houses at home. And what you're having in those cases is their wives are coming to live with them. So women are coming to live with their husbands' groups, and that's creating huge tensions because, as I said, the sister-in-law relationship, as we've already seen, both in the Bam Bam story with Becky and her classificatory sisters-in-law, and what I've talked about more generally is a big thing. So thank you, and that's I'll be delighted to take any questions. I guess we want to break now. Is that right, Camilla?